Hey, welcome to part two. I got my Palpatine going on here, a little cold in my basement, so let's get to it, shall we? We left off talking about the rise of the New Right and its coming together starting in the 1950s to its ultimate political success, its first great political success with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and we talked about the less is more philosophy of Reagan. What we want to do in this lecture is begin talking about the two groups who helped to put New Right politicians like Ronald Reagan into office. And I've kind of talked generally about them, but starting in the 1970s and through then, two coalitions or two groups that have really helped New Right politicians out since that time. And we want to understand both of these groups as turning to people like Ronald Reagan as a part of their attempts to solve the crisis of leadership. The first group we're going to be looking at today is corporate America, particularly big businesses, and how they attempted to meet the crisis of leadership of the 1970s and how that ultimately led them to support New Right politicians like Ronald Reagan. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the other group that have attempted to meet the crisis of leadership, solve the crisis of leadership, conservative evangelicals. But for this lecture, we're going to focus on big business and its support for New Right politicians. We'll say goodbye to Barry Goldwater. America needs a change. Could you imagine a person ever winning office in the United States saying America needs a change or calling for a change? And yeah, well, of course, we know how that played out. So let's talk about two different ways in which big business attempted to provide leadership for America and how that led them into support for New Right politicians like Ronald Reagan. The 1970s were a significant decade in American business history. It's during these years that big businesses, corporate America, began to organize themselves into special interest groups, began to develop lobbying, kind of professional lobbying tools during these years. At the beginning of the 1960s, labor unions actually outnumbered pro-business lobbies in Washington. By the end of the 1970s, I think labor unions outnumbered business lobbies 4-1, starting in 1970. By 1980, that had pretty well even out. The labor unions had started to see decline in the 1970s, while pro-business lobbies had begun to emerge much greater numbers. Today, roughly 2/3 of all registered lobbies in Washington today are pro-business lobbies. And so the 1970 marked a significant turning point away from the power of organized labor that really held from the Wagner Act in 1935 up until the 1960s. We begin to see a shift away in labor power during the 1970s and more towards pro-business groups. And I'll just mention a couple of them. The Business Roundtable, for instance, formed in 1972. The Business Roundtable is composed of America's largest businesses, a lot of defense industries like Boeing and GE, a number of major oil, gas, electric companies, a significant portion of our economy. Forget the exact percentage. I think it was quite half, but a large segment of America's economy was run under found political representation through this new Business Roundtable. What the Business Roundtable attempted to do was to bring these corporations together and to figure how can we pressure Washington in this time of crisis, in this time of kind of the old liberalism of state competence have been called into question. How in this kind of crisis of leadership, particularly leadership of the federal government, can businesses assert themselves and develop a more pro-business agenda going forward. So the Business Roundtable looked to pioneer new techniques. One of the things that they did was send the CEOs of these companies directly to Washington to lobby Congress, to lobby the president where they could just develop the kind of pressure tactics that labor unions had been using on politicians before these years. Big business decided we needed to start doing these things as well too, and so kind of more of a top-down measure. The Business Roundtable sent its CEOs to lobby Congress, to lobby the president on behalf of a more business-friendly agenda. And what kind of things did Business Roundtable corporations, members, what did they ultimately want to see? Well, exactly the same kind of things that politicians like Ronald Reagan would be looking to bring into office. Less is more. Cut taxes, cut welfare spending, deregulate the economy, while maintaining a large military establishment. These were all things that the Business Roundtable corporations supported, and these are things that they would ultimately bring to Congress, bring to candidates like Ronald Reagan, and Reagan would look to enact as President of the United States. Some companies went in a different direction, like ARCO, for instance, set aside some money to pay its employees to do professional lobbying. ARCO would pay its employees to lobby their congressmen, congresspersons, on behalf of the kind of legislation, the kind of agenda that ARCO wanted to see. And largely it was the same agenda we've talked about: cut taxes, cut welfare spending, deregulate the economy. But this is more of a grassroots effort on ARCO's point, attempting to use its own employees to become politically active on behalf of the company, but on behalf of a more pro-business agenda as well too. The Chamber of Commerce, and kind of an old pro-business institution that in the early 1970s was largely dead, was revitalized over the course of the 1970s. The Chamber of Commerce having more active, seeing by 1980 more active branches throughout the United States, all with the goal of, again, at a more grassroots level than, say, the Business Roundtable is working. The Chamber of Commerce is working at a more grassroots, local and state levels to try to lobby politicians, again, both Republican and Democrat, on behalf of a more pro-business friendly agenda moving forward. Again, the 1970s was this crisis of leadership. Before that, into the 1960s, you had, following upon the New Deal, you had Lyndon Johnson's Great Society of the 1960s, which was more of the belief that government could take the lead in developing programs and providing funds that could ultimately help to equalize opportunity in America, to eliminate poverty. Right, the Great Society, part of that was a war on poverty that was waged, and that government was competent to make up for failings in a market economy, particularly try to address racial and class inequities of that period. The 1970s, particularly as America entered into a period of economic uncertainty, all of that kind of older faith seemed to be called into question. In that vacuum of what's the way forward, what should we do? In that vacuum, groups like the Business Roundtable and ARCO, the Chamber of Commerce, are all trying to push this particular agenda. Again, it's the less is more agenda that we've been talking about here. You see that reflected at the national level. Reagan, so-called Reaganomics, I don't think he called it that. I think that people called that about him. They also called it trickle-down economics too. The idea is if we deregulate businesses, we give them a freer hand. If we cut taxes on corporations, that's going to have a trickle-down effect. Okay, as corporations are making more money, as the CEOs, the leaders of these companies, and their shareholders are all making more money, it's going to have a trickle-down effect in that this money will flow down in terms of reinvestment by these companies that will put more people to work and will put them into higher-paying jobs as well, too. So what you'll have is, in trickle-down economics, yes, you will have the wealthy having kind of a freer hand, if you will, to develop more wealth, but you'll see generalized prosperity as well, too, developing during these years. I should say George Herbert Walker Bush, when he was running against Reagan for the Republican nomination in 1980, called Reagan's supply side economics, as it's also called it voodoo economics, and then Bush ultimately became Reagan's vice president running mate, and was asked about voodoo economics, like, downplayed as vice presidents intend to do. But trickle-down economics saw to the extent that America had always or long practiced a kind of trickle-down economics, a policy of allowing the wealthy to amass great wealth with the understanding that they would invest that wealth to produce more jobs, right? The job creators. Some apologists call these individuals, or call this particular strategy, if you will, to the extent that this isn't something new. This is pretty typical of American history. Is allowed the wealthy to become wealthier with the understanding that they would create a generalized prosperity. This was seen as something that was new in the late 70s and 80s. In many ways, it's something that American free marketers had long kind of pushed. But you do see throughout my lifetime, throughout your lifetime, a commitment to making good on the less is more philosophy. The Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003, which were notable, the first time in American history in which the United States went to war, two wars in fact, and cut taxes during those years. It was traditionally understood that when America goes to war, you need to raise taxes. Maybe not during the war, but after the war, you need to raise taxes because you have to pay for those wars. This was the first time that the United States actually cut taxes while increasing defense spending. The reason I put 2010 in there is under the Obama administration, the Bush tax cuts, which were temporary, were made permanent. I believe it was in 2010. So this is not just a Bush thing, a Republican thing. This is something that both parties, Democrats and Republicans, since 1980, have in some ways bought into this less is more philosophy. It's estimated by some that the Bush tax cuts have added about $1 trillion to the national debt every year. Again, it's pretty easy to understand why the national debt's going up. We cut taxes while raising welfare spending. The long promise of Ronald Reagan is we'll cut taxes, so that's less revenue for the government. We can still have a large military establishment, and we can do that through cutting welfare spending. Those two things will balance out. So as we cut entitlement programs like Medicare and Medicaid, cuts to education, we'll be able to afford the tax cuts, and we'll be able to afford a large military establishment. Those cuts to the entitlement programs, though, have never really materialized, and so what you've had are imbalanced budgets. And it's interesting that since Reagan, the Reagan and Republicans cast themselves as the parties of fiscal irresponsibility, fiscal responsibility. Sorry there. It is interesting the national debt has grown since 1980. The national debt has grown greatest under Republican administrations, not under Democratic administrations. And this will again be the case with the Trump tax cuts in 2017. It's estimated that an additional $1 trillion a year are being added to the national deficit. But again, this is in part from new right politicians in league with corporate America, particularly large corporate America, pushing this less is more agenda, cut taxes, cut welfare spending, deregulate the economy while maintaining a large military establishment. Possibly, if that agenda was fully carried through, where you actually did cut entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, cuts to education, things like that, then possibly this could actually work. But absent cuts to entitlement programs and cuts to education, what you have are large budget deficits, and that will continue until something gives on either side. Either we decide we can't afford a large military establishment, we decide we do have to cut the entitlement programs, or we have to raise taxes so that we can afford to pay for them both. You guys figure that one out. The other way in which business provided leadership during these years was through the development of a new form of capitalism. A new form of capitalism that some have called hip or hippie capitalism. I know you guys are all familiar with the hipsters, and what we need to consider in this part of the lecture is to what extent the hipster, for as much as they like to believe that they are countercultural, nonconformist, they're their authentic selves, to refer to a previous lecture, to what extent is the hipster in fact a product of American consumer capitalism? Of course, when we talk about the hippie, we're talking about America's counterculture. We haven't really done that yet. If you thought that when I was talking about the new left or the new left or women's liberation, I was talking about America's counterculture, they were really separate of each other. The new left, it's true stylistically, in the way that the counterculture started wearing blue jeans. Yes, a lot of the new left wore blue jeans. Stylistically, there's similarities there, but the new left was really much more politically and academically oriented, more so than the counterculture. So there's overlaps between America's counterculture and the radical liberal movements that we talked about, but we do need to understand in which they are separate. So you all should have a sense of the hippie of the 1960s, the blue jeans wearing, tie-dye shirt wearing, peace sign wearing, make love not war, drop acid not bombs, right? This kind of if American society in the 1950s, 1960s was all about conformity, the counterculture was about nonconformity. If the 1950s, 1960s were all about the Cold War 50s and 60s were all about status and a concern for keeping up with the Joneses and a high materialistic lifestyle, the counterculture tried to reject status values, tried to reject American materialism, tried to promote simpler forms of living and being. Right? It was all about opposing what they called the man. The counterculture, it was political at points, particularly the anti-war aspect of the counterculture, and especially after 1965, the Vietnam War protests. A lot of the members of the counterculture found a political activism in fighting against the Vietnam War. But really, the counterculture needs to be understood more as more of a cultural movement of rejecting suburban leave it to Beaver, father knows best America. So again, it has overlap with some of the radical liberal movements, but it was much more of a cultural movement, a non-political movement. So the counterculture was all about nonconformity, dropping out, tuning out. How independent was the counterculture? How successful were they at developing an American lifestyle that was independent of consumption? I imagine that some hipsters or hippies of the 1960s, figure out how to kind of sew their own clothes. But how many of them, in fact, bought tie-dye T-shirts, bought the other countercultural wear, bought the blue jeans. To what extent is the counterculture really an extension of the consumer culture of the 1950s, which was itself a consumerist phenomenon, right? Young people are working outside of the home in the 1950s so they can take their significant others to the movies and get milkshakes and put gas in their cars and what have you. We just watched the movie American Graffiti, and as you watch it, think about the amount of money that is needed to sustain the youth and the youth culture at that time. How different is the counterculture of the 1960s and really breaking away from that idea that in order to enjoy a particular kind of lifestyle, you have to spend money. You literally have to buy into it. And to what extent was the countercultural movement of the 60s itself a consumer phenomenon, right? Yes, it's true. Some people probably found ways of painting their own peace signs, but they probably bought them in stores too. Yes, people in the counterculture probably started figuring out how to grow their own food, grow their own pot, but the chances are they probably bought their own food from a growing network of organic food stores, or bought their pot from somebody else. One of the markers of the 1960s was the music. And artists like Janis Joplin and Bob Dylan. Yes, they probably found ways of bootlegging or stealing that music, but probably a lot of American youth bought those records. So, again, to what extent is the counterculture something that Americans youth needed to buy into? How independent was the counterculture and the movement of nonconformity? How independent was that of American consumerism? So when we understand the connections, I think, between the counterculture and a continuing youth consumerism, we can understand how it would make sense that America's capitalist institutions, its businesses, would be looking for ways to capitalize on this new market, to capitalize on the hippie counterculture of the 1960s. And you do see that. We're just going to look at a couple of examples from the time. Volkswagen. The Volkswagen ad campaign of the 1960s. Advertisers who know their histories generally look at the Volkswagen ad campaign run by Bill Bernbach and his advertising agency DDB as one of the revolutionary ads. American cars in the 1950s were, well, you can kind of see a typical ad for an American car here in the 1950s. What do you notice about the car, and what do you notice about the ad? Well, one, you might notice that the car is big. And in fact, Americans liked big cars because you can't put 2.5 kids very easily into a car like a Volkswagen. So this was an immediate challenge that Bernbach faced when Volkswagen came to him and said, hey, could you help us? We want to sell more Volkswagens in the United States. Can you help us do this? Bernbach recognized this is not a typical American car. This is not where Americans are at in the 1950s, right? They want these big gas guzzling cars that they can put their 2.5 kids in and drive around. And so Bernbach realizes that, one, he's going to have to develop a new strategy for selling a car like the Volkswagen, but two, lest you think that hippie capitalism is some kind of evil maniacal capitalist looking to profit on changing patterns of American culture. Bernbach himself was somebody who was sick of doing car ads like you see featured on the left there. A lot of advertisers were just sick of doing the same formulaic, family-friendly kinds of ads that you see, pictured here, right? They themselves wanted to reinvent advertising as a kind of art form, and at its core, it is. At its core, advertising should be a form of art. It's in many ways the primary form of art in American history is advertising, and it should be more creative. And so Bernbach himself was, he recognized having to take on the Volkswagen ad challenge as something that would be personally fulfilling for him as well too. And so what he came up with was the Volkswagen ad campaign of the early 1960s. Now, what contrasts do you see between your kind of typical 50s car ad and the 1960s car ad for Volkswagen there? And I'll just let you work through on your own some of the differences. Do notice the advertisement there, the 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57. No, you get the point, right? Whereas American car companies wanted people to buy not just cars, but they wanted them to buy the latest models of the cars, and an emphasis was put on American car manufacturers on upgrading their models each year in an effort to make them more attractive to families wanting to trade in old models for new models. That's not what Volkswagen is about, right? What are they trying to say? 51, 52, 53, 54. This is the same car year after year. Volkswagen makes this car, and it's the same car. We don't innovate. It's the same thing year after year. You can see how this could appeal to someone who was looking to break with the status quo, someone who was not wanting to keep up with the Joneses, but maybe wanting to keep down with the Joneses, to show that they weren't materialistic, that they weren't concerned about status and fashion and materialism, that a car like the Volkswagen, incredibly minimalistic, simple, could appeal to individuals, particularly young individuals, who wanted a simpler car. Remember where we began this lecture with a guy standing next to his Volkswagen bus. It's in the early 1960s, thanks to advertising like Bill Bernbach's, that the Volkswagen emerges as the car of America's counterculture. Calling a car a lemon, or featuring a bunch of these cars all together exactly the same. This is revolutionary stuff, but it worked in highlighting the Volkswagen is the car for those people who want to drop out of the rat race. The Volkswagen is the car for people who value simplicity, minimalism, reliability. They're not concerned about status. They're not trying to communicate something about themselves through their car, but they are, in fact, just wanting to get from point A to point B, and not trying to, kind of say something about themselves through the products that they consume, right? This was not a car for conspicuous consumption. This was about appealing to a new kind of consumer. But understand that ad campaigns develop new consumers as well too. And so that's what's going on with Volkswagen here in the 1960s, is not simply just that there's people out there already who value minimalism and we're providing the Volkswagen for them. It's people out there who don't necessarily know what they want. And they're provided with the option of the Volkswagen as a way to say something about themselves while not saying something about themselves, right? Your rejection of status values is in many ways still your pursuit of a status value. Just like the hipster might be somebody who is trying to suggest they're not like everyone else. Well, that in many ways is them still trying to say something about themselves. It shows that they're very concerned about status. And in this particular case, right, Bernbach wants you to buy a car that will reflect something about yourself. You're a minimalist. You're simple. You're a counterculturalist. But in order to participate in this counterculture, you still need to have the car. You still need to buy the car. You still need to get the car somehow, right? So, in this case, the hippie with their VW car is still a product of consumer capitalism. It's still having to buy your way into a particular status, but now your status is one of a counterculturalist or as a hippie. Just to kind of round this out, look at the Volkswagen continues to engage in this kind of countercultural advertising to the present. I've got an ad for you to look at. This is more recent. I think it was about 10, 15 years ago from Volkswagen. But you can see them continuing to do this.
Because Daddy never hugged me. Because Daddy never hugged me. Because Daddy never hugged me. Because Daddy never hugged me.
Because the more guys notice me, the more I love myself.
Because I make more money than you. Because I make more money.
Mine's only about yay big. Because mine's only about yay big. Because mine's only about yay big.
The Volkswagen Passat, lowest ego emissions of any German engineered sedan. The Volkswagen Passat, lowest ego emissions of any German engineered sedan.
Lowest ego emissions. The Volkswagen in the 1960s, the Volkswagen today remains the car for people who do not concern about trying to communicate something about themselves through what they consume. But still, what you have going on here is these individuals who buy the Volkswagen still have not escaped capitalism, right? They still are buying the products, and they still are looking to communicate something about themselves through the products they consume. Fun fact: it is interesting that the Volkswagen becomes the Volkswagen becomes the symbol, the car, the official car of American counterculture, right? Who ultimately was the brainchild of the Volkswagen? Where does this car come from? And some of you are piecing it together. It comes from Germany, right? Volk, the people. This is the people's wagon. This is the people's car. This is a car that was to help get Germans to be able to, a cheap car that they could afford would help get them from point A to point B. And who ultimately was the brainchild of the Volkswagen? Yeah, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, his idea, his car, becomes the car of America's counterculture in the 1960s. You can't make this stuff up. Similar dynamic going on with Pepsi. You can see in the right corner there how Pepsi ads in the 1950s looked to attach themselves to significant events in the life of young people. You can kind of see the kind of things that in the 1950s American youth supposedly valued, or at least was supposed to value, right? It's not, what do you see in these ads? And I know some of you are raising your hands right now. You're saying wealth, esteem, social gathering, marriage, right? All the things that youth are intended or supposed to value to fit in, to conform in American society, and Pepsi is there to help you at those significant moments of your rise from youth into adulthood, of your passage from irresponsibility into marriage. Pepsi is there to help guide you along the way. Except that American youth, the primary consumers of soft drinks in the late 50s and 1960s, are not doing this kind of thing anymore. They are dropping out of the rat race. They are pioneering America's counterculture, and Pepsi has to kind of figure out, how do we sell to these young people who are changing? And as Pepsi is working through these things, they realize it's not just how do we sell to youth, but to the extent that advertising is about selling lifestyle. Because if you can sell a lifestyle, you can sell all kinds of products with it, right? If you can sell what an upper middle class New York City lifestyle is supposed to be like, you can sell all kinds of products to accommodate that. Pepsi is here at the vanguard of lifestyle advertising realizing not just the question that we should be asking ourselves here in the early 1960s is not just how do we sell to young people, but Pepsi and their ad executives come to the conclusion it's not just how do we sell to youth, but how do we sell youth itself. And so is given birth in the early 1960s the Pepsi Generation ad campaign, the Think Young ad campaign. Britney Spears Asking for More is ultimately a revival of Pepsi's 1960 ads. A Pepsi for those who, not for those who are young, but for those who think young. As Pepsi would go on to explain in many of their ads, youth is ultimately a state of mind. It's something that everyone, no matter what your age, can ultimately embrace. You can embrace youth and you can embrace the values of youth. So Pepsi is here at, and you're not exactly seeing the hipsters in their ads. Pepsi's not going that far. But it is featuring youth independent of parents, independent of the supervision of parents, the supervision of society. It's featuring youth, and particularly young men and women outside of apparently marriage contexts, enjoying themselves. And Pepsi is for those who embrace this newer, freer, non-conforming lifestyle of the counterculture. So Pepsi is here not just selling Pepsi to young people, but it's beginning to try to sell the values of the counterculture itself, particularly an attitude of youthfulness and nonconformity, in energy and spontaneity. You might notice when you went to find this video that I posted also a kind of compilation of Pepsi ads. I'd encourage you to watch through that. And what you'll see as you go through, it's about an 11-minute video. You don't need to watch all of it. You can skim through some of it. But you'll see that it features some of the ads from the 1950s to the 1960s. And the person who put it together is really smart. They understood how Pepsi's representations of American youth and American culture in general are shifting during these years. And you can kind of track the shift from a conforming, keep up with the Joneses America to the countercultural authenticity pursuing America of the 1960s. You can in some ways track that through watching these Pepsi ads. And again, this is an example of this hippie capitalism, as we talked about, because now it's encouraging people to consume not to fit in, but consume to non-conform. For those who value non-conformity and youth and spontaneity, Pepsi is here to help you during these times. So Pepsi is still attaching itself to a particular lifestyle, but now it is the lifestyle of youthfulness and youth having a life beyond parental and social supervision, and ultimately embracing the kind of countercultural individualism of these years as well too. Soda companies, think of the Mountain Dew, the Dew. Not all of American capitalism converted to hippie capitalism. You still get throughout a lot of American advertising more traditional ads you would have seen in the 1950s, but some companies still kind of promote a more youthful, countercultural vision through their advertising. Soda companies are some of those. Clothing companies are some of those as well too. Clothing advertisements are in all the way up to the present still a way of trying to convince American youth in particular, and I guess their parents, because the parents are the ones with the checkbooks, that you can express yourself as an individual through the clothes that you wear. I'm going to show you some pictures here of Kirk Cameron, and to see how this linkage of being cool as a consumer phenomenon worked its way out in these years of the 1980s. You see Kirk Cameron there certainly thinks that he's pretty cool, but you got to ask yourself, how much did those clothes cost his parents for him to be able to express himself as one cool dude? Some of you might be smiling right now and saying, I don't know that's necessarily Kirk Cameron. Who is that person? Well, that one in the center seems to be Kirk Cameron, but who's the other guy around there? And some of you have maybe figured it out at this point. Yeah. Those are my senior high pictures. Yeah, that was me. I had 3 trench coats, in fact. That was my acid wash one. And, we got it on sale, but still. We spent a lot of money. My mom and I spent a lot of money on myself in the 1980s so that I could try to look cool or express myself as a cool dude. And, I didn't date much. What does this have to do? What does this have to do with the new right in the way that big business, supported the new right and provided cultural leadership? Again, don't take away from this hippie capitalism as kind of evil, greedy Madison Avenue advertisers and corporations conspiring to get more money, particularly out of American youth. In many cases, the people who developed these kind of ad campaigns were people who were fed up with the conformity of America itself. So don't blame those individuals. Blame the pathology, if you will, of 1950s America that produced this counter reaction, this counterculture, and a more extreme emphasis on individualism. But what does seem to be the case is in the 60s all the way up to the present is that the counterculture has in many ways become mainstreamed during these years, particularly if the counterculture was about achieving a sense of self independent of society. We want to call that authenticity, nonconformity, self-direction, you do you, whatever you want to call that. Clearly, what companies like DDB and Pepsi were able to do is take countercultural values and mainstream such that those values are mainstream values today. Everybody wants to think of themselves, liberal or conservative, wants to think themselves as not conforming, but as an individual, as their own self. We are in many ways a nation of rebels. And we do have to admit, too, the extent to which our expressions of our individuality are tied up with consumerism through the kind of money that we spend. Now, you can ultimately evaluate yourselves along this regards. I know that college students might be like, no, man, I am not looking to say something through the clothes that I wear. I need to buy the clothes as cheap as I can because I'm in college, and that's the best that I can do. Or my car doesn't say anything about me. My car is just gets me from point A to point B. And so you might find yourself or think yourself somehow beyond the pale of this hippie capitalism. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. I'll leave that for you to decide. But the ability of corporate America to adjust its message, to figure out not only how to market to the counterculture and to the hipsters of today, but how to market countercultural values, to market the hipster values to larger mainstream America, has meant that those companies continue to reap generous profits. With those profits, they're able to do things like give money to the Business Roundtable, to go to Washington and lobby for pro-business legislation on their behalf, right? If you want, you can go check out killercoke.org. People have, Coke has bottling plants all over the world, and Central American companies. People have suggested that Coke has even paid paramilitary groups to go in and kill labor organizers in these Central American plants. Is Coke, I mean, we know that drinking enough Coke over the course of one's life will literally kill you, but is it possible that Coke has actually been killing people in terms of putting hits out on labor organizers in Central American bottling plants? Well, we don't necessarily know, because Coca-Cola makes, through the Business Roundtable, is able to, through the profits that Coke is able to continue to generate by not just selling soda to young people, but by selling youth itself in the way that Pepsi continues to do so as well too. We just our leaders just don't look too closely at corporate behavior, particularly corporate behavior in other countries, and so we won't really know what exactly Coke has done in its Central American bottling plants, because through groups like the Business Roundtable, and emphases on deregulation, of backing off of oversight of American corporations, and this is made possible because these companies remain profitable. They remain profitable because they found, after 1960, new ways of advertising to new people, and to advertising new lifestyles as well too. So to sum all this up, the rise of the New Right was a long time in coming, but we need to understand too groups that helped the New Right along the way and up to the present. And so corporate America, especially beginning in the 1970s, began to find these William F. Buckley Jr., Barry Goldwater kinds of politicians, and began to provide support for them. In turn, as those politicians would push for the kind of less is more philosophy the New Right ultimately would embrace too. But we need to understand too that these groups like Big Business, they recognized the crisis of the leadership that America was going through in the 1970s, and they tried to provide their own answers to that crisis. And so one of the answers to America's crisis in the 1970s was the answer that was provided by groups like the Business Roundtable or the Pepsi Company, particularly as those groups found an alliance with people like Ronald Reagan, Newt Gingrich, the Bushmen, all the way up to a Donald Trump. But there was another group that has also tried to solve the crisis of leadership, provide a moral leadership and moral direction for America since the 1970s, and they have lent significant support for New Right politicians from running from Ronald Reagan all the way up to the present. And that is conservative white evangelicals. The subject of our last lecture in this course will be talking about the rise of the religious right during the 1970s. Take care.